Hello and welcome to the Wild Side with your host, Kight. That was Blitz and Trapper singing Sleepy Time in the Western World. And today we are going to be talking about the science of sleep. Now, first of all, I think it's important to think about what sleep is. And that's kind of a silly thing to do because we all sleep every day, and so we probably think we know what sleep is. But it's kind of nice to stand back for a second and think about all the different things that characterize sleep. So, first of all, it's a period of reduced activity. Obviously, we're not doing a whole lot, we're just lying there in bed. It's also associated with a typical posture. Now for us that involves lying down and closing our eyes, but we also know that in other species they may do things like clutch onto a branch, or for bats, for instance, they will hang upside down. So whatever it is, there's some sort of a posture that you see being repeated every single time. It also results in decreased responsiveness to environmental stimuli, so you know that sometimes if you are a really heavy sleeper, then you might not pay any attention when there is a noise or when there are bright lights that suddenly appear in the middle of the night. And of course there are also light sleepers, or people that are kind of in the middle, but there is this range where even if you are quite a light sleeper, generally when something happens you don't pay attention to it, you don't respond to it to quite the same extent as you would if you were awake. And sleep is also a state that's relatively easy to reverse. So some of these things that I've mentioned are quite similar to what we might find in an animal that's hibernating or in someone that's in a coma. And those are obviously quite distinct conditions to sleep. And that's why sleep is kind of classified separately, because you can wake up fairly easily most of the time. Now, as I've said, the exact characteristics of sleep do differ from one species to the next. But all known organisms do show some sort of analogous behavior. And this basically is just, a periodic fluctuation between being active and also taking a period of rest. And this is true even of things like bacteria and the kind of so-called simpler organisms. And that's because they do have this kind of cycling where they are responding to the changes in day length. And that's something that I'll get into in a bit more detail later. So we do all have this kind of rhythmic activity that is associated with the patterns of the celestial bodies that kind of, basically govern our world and the things that we do out in nature. Now there are actually different types of sleep, which most of you are probably familiar with because you've all heard of REM sleep and the sleep during which you dream as opposed to the sleep where you are getting much more rest. So REM sleep, REM stands for rapid eye movement. And this period of sleep is characterized by really intense brain activity, and it's thought that that activity is what causes us to dream. And the other type of sleep that you have, this is, hold on to yourselves here, this is pretty exciting, is non-REM sleep. I know we can be very creative sometimes when we're naming things. And non-REM sleep has 3 different stages, and these are named N1, N2, and N3, also very exciting names. And basically all of these types of sleep, they do kind of differ during these 3 different stages, but each of them is unrelated to the rapid eye movements, and you don't tend to dream as much, and that's why they're all classified together in this non-REM category. Now, even though we do know quite a lot about sleep, which you'll find out as I talk about it here, it's still mysterious in lots of different ways. And one of the most fundamental ways is that very little work has focused on exploring why and how sleep evolved to begin with. And basically, at the heart of the matter is the fact that there's this trade-off. And the trade-off is between needing to recharge our brains and also needing to be alert. So we need to recharge our brains because it's a type of tissue that can't store energy. And that's just because of the way that it's made, the kind of the physical properties of our brain. And so we need to get energy back in there so that we can, fuel our neurons to do all the things that we do as we're thinking deeply and kind of coordinating behaviors and regulating our bodies. But even though the best way to do that is to kind of shut things down, you also need to think about the fact that you need to stay alert and you need to stay awake in order to stay safe and keep on the lookout for predators. And so you might think that maybe you could kind of shut down parts of your brain, or maybe an entire half of your brain, and let the other half stay awake so you can recharge one half at a time. And there actually are animals that do this. For instance, dolphins and whales will do this so that they have half of their brain awake to tell them to go up and breathe periodically so that they don't drown. But for the bulk of animals, and for humans, it definitely seems better to completely shut down the brain all at once because it seems more efficient that way. So even though we are losing out on the ability to be aware during that time, we can still benefit by the fact that it takes us less overall time to recharge relative to the amount of time that we're spending without any kind of awareness of the environment. But whatever the dynamics are that kind of made this process evolve from whatever it started out as, it's clearly something that's essential for proper functioning and proper health. And so it's something that's really important to get enough of and to understand. So sleep is characterized by a lot of different physiological changes that are associated with the fact that our body has fewer demands when it's sleeping. And these physiological traits may be more variable, such as during the REM sleep, but more regular during the non-REM sleep. And this is because, as I said before, the REM sleep has to do a lot with that rapid brain activity, and so you can have lots of things going on, and then eventually things kind of come to a bit more of a standstill and let your body kind of get into a more relaxed rhythm. Now, one of the things that we see in people who are sleeping is that they experience a temperature drop. And this begins to happen just before we sleep, so our bodies really begin to cool down. And this seems to be something that can help induce sleep. And so that's why a lot of times if you're not able to fall asleep, people will recommend that you go take a shower or a bath that's kind of warm, so that when you step out of it, you have that difference in temperature from the warm of the water to the cool of the air, and that will start cooling you off, and you'll feel that difference and that shift, and that will kind of induce sleep. And in fact, during sleep, our temperature can drop by 1 or 2 degrees, which doesn't sound like much, but it can actually, that can be a significant change. If you've ever been outside, maybe waiting for a cold bus, for instance, on a windy day like today, you really do feel those couple of degrees. And this is kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. So first of all, whenever the temperature gets lower, we're using less energy. And so this may be potentially one purpose of sleep, or at least one benefit of sleep, is that this allows us to conserve the energy that we would otherwise have used to keep ourselves warm. But it's also interesting because we do have this period during REM sleep where the biggest drop occurs, and then after that our temperature starts going up again. And so it's quite interesting that during this time you actually can lose quite a lot of heat, and this can potentially be dangerous depending on what sort of environment you're in. And so you often find that people in REM sleep have a different body posture than people who are in non-REM sleep. They'll curl up and try to maintain heat a bit more. This might be the time when your partner is snuggling up to you most in bed and trying to stay warm. And then later on you guys can roll apart and stay quite comfortable even though you're not sharing body heat. So there are kind of some dynamics that are involved with shifting from one phase of sleep to the other and maintaining that body temperature. Another thing that happens when we sleep is that our breathing slows and becomes deeper. And you'll be familiar with this if you've ever kind of watched someone fall asleep. If you've even seen a pet or a small child and you've been able to see them up close, you can kind of feel this pattern and see it quite obviously. And the breathing becomes more regular because it's not adjusted for other types of activities. So of course when we're moving or talking or doing other things, we tend to breathe a bit more shallowly and more often. But when we're sleeping, we're just kind of doing one thing quite steadily, and so we can get quite a nice rhythm occurring. And again, as with some of the other things I've already started to talk about, you do see more variability in the REM period, and you can actually have an increase in breathing rate. And this does seem to be related to the fact that we have all that brain firing and we're dreaming a whole lot, and so we can react to those dreams with our breathing patterns in the same way that we would if we were awake during those sorts of activities. So now you probably would guess that in relation to these changes, the temperature drop and the breathing changes, we also do experience reductions in cardiovascular activity. So basically the heart can rest while we're sleeping because again we're not having to do as much, we're not expending as much energy, and so it can beat at a much lower rate. And this means that some people have thought maybe another potential function of sleep is allowing the heart to rest. Now again, this could be something that's just a side effect of sleep. It's a nice correlate basically, but it also could be one of the things that has helped sleep evolve because it does give our heart a chance to not do as much work and so maybe kind of recuperate a bit from all the stresses of the day. And during non-REM sleep, we do find that both heart rate and blood pressure are reduced, but again, during the REM sleep, they can be more variable and quite a bit higher. So all this is, I know, a bit repetitive with the differences between REM and non-REM, but they do really highlight the fact that the REM period when you're dreaming has a whole lot going on, and it's actually these stimuli that we have in our dreams can be quite similar in how they make us react to the sort of stimuli that we experience every day in the real world. Now, there are other reduced activities as well that aren't quite as obvious to anyone who's watching a sleeper or who is experiencing sleep. So things like reduction in kidney function, which is associated with production in urine. So basically, this is what allows us to get through the whole night without having to pee, although some of us will, of course, have to get up and go to the bathroom every now and then. But generally, you do it less often during that 8 or 9 hour period than you would during that same length of period during the daytime. There are also some activities that increase during sleep, and these are things like the release of growth hormone and growth itself. And this is something that you might be familiar with if you have kids or if you have friends who have kids. You always learn about this when you're going through pregnancy, is that your kids do most of their growing at night. And that's because this is when the growth hormone is released, and the children can muster all of those bits of energy that they've, as they've been eating during the day, they store away this energy and then they burn it all off at night doing their growth. You also have an increase in digestion, and this is one of the reasons that a lot of people wake up and are immediately quite hungry in the morning, because the stomach and intestines have processed all the food and they're ready for the next batch. Cellular repair increases at night, which is really important because this kind of goes in with that whole idea of sleep as a regenerative period, allowing you to kind of get back on your feet, so to speak, and kind of repair the systems that need some help. And basically all of these things together indicate that even though sleep is a really important function for getting energy back into the brain and kind of resetting your clock, it's also really important for helping your body maintain a proper amount of health and kind of just maintain everything in a good kind of proper energetic level so that you can face whatever it is you're going to need to face during the day. Now, people used to think that the brain was quite inactive during sleep, but now we know this is not true, and our understanding of the natural sleep pattern has been changed and or improved by the invention of what's called an EEG, or an electroencephalogram. And this actually happened way back in 1929, which is pretty amazing. This was quite a breakthrough at that time. Now, this is something that allowed researchers to see really how dynamic sleep is, because they could see what the brain was doing at all these stages throughout the night. And this is a tool that's still used today. If people have issues with sleeping, they can hook them up to an EEG machine and look at what the brain is doing and monitor their sleeping patterns. But these days, we don't just use an EEG, we also couple it with all sorts of other things. So we have equipment that measures eye movements and looks at muscle activity. We have cameras that we can hook up that see in the dark, so we can see exactly what people are doing, as well as measuring these different kind of physiological things that are happening. And all told, this means that we know a lot about how there are changes in amounts of neuronal firing, as well as coordination and synchronicity of firing. And this allows us to know a lot more about the two different major stages of sleep and all the things that happen during them. And just after the break, I'll come back and talk about those in a little bit more detail. But first, I'm going to play She and Him singing If You Can't Sleep. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was She and Him singing If You Can't Sleep. And I have to admit, it wasn't maybe the best idea to play a lullaby in the middle of my broadcast, because that has made me feel quite relaxed. But I'll try to get energetic again. What we were talking about before the break was the fact that we have developed some amazing technologies that have allowed us to look at sleep in quite a lot of detail and understand what's happening at night when people aren't conscious. And one of the things is that we've been able to really look at all of the different neuron firing rates and patterns. This has allowed us to understand a lot more about the different categories of sleep and also what's happening during them. So REM sleep, I already mentioned, rapid eye movement sleep. It's also called active sleep. And this is the period when you have an increase in the firing rate of most of the neurons throughout the brain. And in fact, some regions show more activity than when we're awake. And these different firing patterns tend to be low amplitude and high frequency. And they can be quite random and variable, just as we have during wakefulness. And all of this activity these different waveforms and this different activity level, this seems to be responsible for the dreams that we experience when we're asleep. Now, dreams are something that I kind of referred to a few times throughout this broadcast, but I'm not really going to go into in a whole lot of detail. And they're actually something that I do hope to come back to and talk about in a further episode, because actually you could talk all day about dreams and what is known and what's not known about them and kind of the purpose that they may serve evolutionarily speaking. So that's kind of a black box that I'll ignore for now, but I'll delve into a bit later on. So, of course, the other thing that characterizes REM sleep is the rapid eye movements that this period is named for, and these do appear to be associated with dreams in some way or another. REM sleep also comes with paralysis of arm and leg muscles, and this is really important because it seems to kind of function as a neurological barrier that prevents people from acting out the stuff that they're dreaming about. Because as I said, the REM patterns are quite similar, the neuronal patterns, to the ones that we have during the day. So clearly the brain and the body perceive these things as being quite realistic in many cases. And if you didn't have this kind of neurological barrier, you might just pop out of bed and start roaming around and doing things, which in fact some people do, and that can be quite dangerous. Now, non-REM sleep is something, as I said before, that has been broken up into 3 different categories: N1, N2, and N3. And during this time you see the slowing of brain waves and also an increase in the synchronicity of the brain waves. The eyes remain still, which is why it's called non-REM sleep. And this is the period when we have actually the deepest sleep that we experience during a night, and that's during the N3 stage. And during this time the brain waves are very high amplitude but quite low frequency. And that's why we refer to this as being deep and also slow wave in terms of what type of sleep it is. Now, as I mentioned earlier, humans involve their entire brain in the sleep process, but other animals will rest only one hemisphere at a time. And this allows them to kind of better balance out the maintenance of vigilance, but also the energy kind of, and other benefits of sleep itself. But there are lots of different patterns that we see throughout the animal world, and one of the things that's not very well understood is why it is that we have these differentiations from one type of species to the next. Now, it's pretty clear in things like dolphins and whales why it would be useful to have one half awake, because again, as I mentioned, these things are going up to the surface to breathe, and so clearly they do need to have something that kind of tells them to do that. But you know, that's also the kind of thing that you think might be bundled into the brainstem and these other parts of the brain that aren't involved in sleeping. So why is it that this is what they've evolved? Why have they evolved something different from people? It's quite an interesting field of study that really could use a whole lot more exploration. Now, I mentioned that dreams are kind of a black box that I won't really get into, but I will say a couple of quick things before talking about the patterns of sleep. Dreams are really a notable part of sleep, but they're not very well understood, to be honest. So we tend to have quite bizarre, illogical, random collections of thoughts. They sometimes appear to be related to things that happen during our waking hours, but not really. And most of the visually intense dreaming is found during REM sleep, but there are also other events that can occur during non-REM sleep. So technically they aren't really considered the same thing as dreaming, but they are things that are kind of similar in that they are bizarre, random kind of ideas. So night terrors are a good example of this. And night terrors are quite a horrifying experience to people that do suffer from them, and they can be a recurring issue. And you know, a lot of people during this time, just like in dreams, they have these visions, but they aren't able to do anything because they're still paralyzed, and the body, the arms and the legs aren't moving as they would when we're awake. So there are these interesting kind of relationships between the sorts of firing patterns that our brains are going through as they sleep and what we're able to do physically in response to those things. And basically, although not a whole lot is known about this, people think that perhaps dreams may allow the brain to help form memories and kind of make connections that we can then utilize later on whenever we're out in the real world and need to kind of put 2 and 2 together. But at the same time, it's also quite possible that they could simply represent random activity that's just kind of a strange firing patterns that our neurons go through as they eventually fall to rest during the non-REM period. And this is all something that I will explore in greater detail in a further episode. But for now, I want to talk a little bit more about the natural patterns of sleep. And this really kind of gets into a more basic idea of why is it that we have sleep, and why is it that we have a period of wakefulness and a period during which we're not awake. And this is really driven by two interactive systems. And the first of these is our internal biological clock, and the second is our sleep-wake homeostat. And these two things keep us awake during the day and asleep at night. And even if you are a person who maybe has a reversed schedule, so perhaps you work on a shift, you do still have these kind of drives where you want to be awake during the day and asleep at night. Even if you kind of can overcome those and switch yourself to a more night owlish sort of schedule, your body will have these kind of fundamental drives most of the time. So together, these two things are responsible for what's called our sleep drive. And the sleep drive is the urge to sleep, and also the associated lack of alertness or awareness that happens when we are awake for an extended period of time. Now, the reason that we refer to something called the sleep-wake homeostat is that the sleep drive is something that's homeostatic. It's internally maintained. And this is the same thing that you can say of things like blood pressure and temperature. So it's something that we have sensors about within our body, and we kind of regulate it and help it move along as it should be moving with a whole lot of internal processes. And the longer we're awake, the stronger we have a feeling of needing to sleep. And that, again, is because of this homeostatic sleep drive. And this is something that can't really be easily measured, but it seems to be caused by the fact that we have more and more brain activity. So the more your brain works, the more tired you get. And that appears to be related to the fact that as your brain works, it produces adenosine. And adenosine is something that's a byproduct of cellular energy consumption. So you guys probably had some basic biology. You know that as we burn energy, we use something called ATP. And when you burn that energy in ATP form, you end up releasing adenosine. And the more you have adenosine, the more tired you feel. And this seems to happen because adenosine inhibits the brain cells that promote alertness. So basically, you can be very alert in the morning when you've burned off all that adenosine, but then the longer your brain works, the more the adenosine piles up. It starts covering up the fact that you feel alert, so it's preventing this activity of helping you feel nice and awake, and so then you start feeling more and more sleepy. And of course, during sleep we have processes that go around in our brain and help the adenosine dissipate so we can start from scratch in the morning, hopefully. But sleep is also regulated by more than just the homeostatic sleep drive. Otherwise, we would do a whole bunch of cat naps all day to get rid of adenosine and we would feel great. And this is not what happens with most people. Often you might notice if you're tired at 3 p.m., you're equivalently tired at 8 p.m. So basically, we have these strange kind of patterns that even if we have little bits of rest or little bits of caffeine consumption, we still feel tired because of more than just that adenosine buildup in the brain. And that's because we have something called a circadian alerting system. And this is driven by a collection of neurons that are deep in the brain, and they regulate our biological clocks. And we've all heard about biological clocks, but maybe not talked about them in a whole lot of detail. And these are these cells that are responding to the fact that we are exposed to light during the day. And we have cells in our eyes that do respond to the reception of light, and so it tells our internal clocks that the day has gone on and now it's becoming longer and longer and we should be getting sleepier and sleepier. And so this biological clock signal, it increases the signal to oppose the sleep drive, but then eventually shuts off to allow sleep. So we've got all of these nice things working in concert with each other, so that the sleepier we get, the more we have this biological clock signal that's working against that sleep drive signal, but then eventually both of them kind of shut off and let us go to sleep and reset. Now, within a single night of sleep for a healthy adult, you should start with a period called the alpha activity period. And this is quite a rhythmic sort of wave pattern that indicates that you're awake, but you're still quite relaxed. So this is what you're feeling when you first lie down and you're starting to drift off into sleep. You're not quite asleep, you're not quite awake, you're in the alpha activity phase. And once you've gotten there, you will then transition to the non-REM sleep. And first you'll go through N1, then N2, and then N3. And overall, these three things will last for about an hour and a half maximum. It could be shorter than this as well. And from the non-REM sleep phase, you'll go through a little bit of a lighter NREM phase, and then finally down into REM sleep. So you don't immediately go into your dream sleep. You first go through a period that's more restful, and then you kind of pop back out, if you like, and you start having all this brain firing. And then you'll go back into NREM sleep again, and you'll keep cycling between these two things throughout the whole night. Most of the night you'll spend in non-REM sleep, so that accounts for 75 to 80% of the sleep that you'll have during the entire night, and then the other 20 to 25% is your dream sleep or your REM sleep. And some of you probably are thinking, when I sleep, I dream all night. I just wake up with tons of different dreams. And that certainly is the case with me. And that's not because you have some sort of abnormally long period of REM sleep, but that's simply because that is the sleep that you remember more clearly than the non-REM sleep. And that's because you're so deeply asleep then that you aren't registering any memories of that event. So throughout the night, as you have these cyclings back and forth between non-REM and REM sleep, the REM periods will become longer and longer. So you start off with something that's about 70 to 100 minutes long for the first cycle, but then this will lengthen to 90 to 120 minutes later on. So you'll have several of these throughout the night, and then eventually emerge in the morning after having kind of a lighter bit right in between to transition you back out into wakefulness. And the reason for the cycling is unknown. This is yet another of the many things that needs to be investigated in more detail. But for now, researchers think that the reason we do this is that for some reason or another, it seems to optimize the benefits of sleep, whether that's memory formation or cell regeneration or growth or whatever the case may be, that going back and forth and having different types of brain activity at different times seems to help make that process work better. And that was Iron and Wine singing The Devil Never Sleeps. And in case you happen to want to look that up, that is the acoustic version that he released off of his website rather than the regular version that was on the commercial album. So we were talking about sleep today, as you might have guessed because of the name of that song. Before the break, I was talking about natural patterns of sleep. And most of us do tend to have one of these. We fall somewhere in that natural range, even though there is some variation. But there are lots of things that can have an impact on our sleep pattern, so that from one person to the next you can see quite a huge fluctuation, and also from one night of sleep to the next you can see fluctuations even within a single individual. And some of these things that cause the sleep pattern to change can be short-term impacts, but there also can be longer-term things that can change sleep patterns. So I'll go through each of these in order. So first of all, thinking about the short-term impacts on sleep patterns, one of the major things that can affect sleep is light. And this can be both a direct effect, so the presence of light can make it hard for you to fall asleep, or it can be an indirect effect, so by influencing your internal clock. And as I mentioned, we have these photoreceptors in our retinas that register the presence of light and tell our brains whether it's daytime or nighttime, and then make us respond accordingly to whatever time of day it is. Now, a lot of people think that the presence of artificial lighting in our daily routines has probably altered our sleep patterns relative to those that were experienced by early humans, or even by humans just a couple of hundred years ago before the Industrial Revolution. And of course, it's not very easy to collect data on that because you'd have to be relying on historical sources. But it is quite logical to think that now that we're exposed to lots of artificial light throughout the day, that perhaps we're having to adjust in response. And one particularly strong thing is probably the presence of light in the late evening. So we spend most of our days in well-lit office-type environments, which probably would be about equivalent to, early agrarians spending their time out in the field or in the barn or wherever. But the thing that really makes a difference is the fact that when our working day is through, we go home and have an equal amount of light in our homes. Whereas people, back in the day, they would have just had little bits of candles or maybe no light at all. They would have just had a fire, and so it was much darker then. They probably would have gone to sleep earlier and had maybe a longer night, although again it's quite hard to tell. But certainly we probably do fall asleep later in the day because of all this fluorescent lighting that we are exposed to. Now, light in the middle of the night can also have a big impact, and if you're someone who is exposed to periodic lights in the middle of the night, you may notice that actually this can be quite unpredictable, because it really kind of depends on what sleep stage you're in and whether you wake up enough to really respond to this and register it, whether you open your eyes when there's light or whether you keep them kind of screwed shut tightly. Because if you do have a lot of light in the middle of the night, it can make it quite hard for you to fall back asleep, and that's because it can reset your internal clock. But if there is light that's out there, but you're kind of keeping your head covered or you always keep your eyes shut, then it may not affect you nearly as much. So this is a really good reason for you to have night lights throughout your house. So if you are the sort of person who has to get up to check on a child or let out the dog or go to the bathroom, it's a really good idea to try to do all of that in complete darkness, or to have a night light that's really unobtrusive and isn't going to put a whole lot of light into your eyes so that it's not going to disrupt your sleep pattern when you try to get back into bed and go back to sleep. Now, medical conditions can also have effects on your sleep patterns, and lots of different conditions, both medical and psychological, can affect sleep. So these include things as various as chronic pain, acid reflux, stress. For women, the time of the month, so whatever your hormone flows are, that can also change. So there are all sorts of things that can really affect, your medical conditions can really affect your sleep. And these also can affect sleep in lots of different ways. So whether we fall asleep at all, what time we fall asleep, how long we stay asleep, the cycling from one type of sleep pattern to the next, so all sorts of different things. And stress is kind of particularly interesting because it seems to be an evolutionary response. So if we are feeling quite stressful, then evolutionarily that would often be a situation where we're feeling stressful because maybe there are predators in the environment or lots of bad storms or something else out there that we need to be aware of and we need to be kind of on edge about so that we can respond to it if we need to. And so not being able to sleep very well when you are feeling stressful is something that actually could keep you quite safe. But of course now we live in an era when we feel stressful about things that are kind of disturbing over the long term, and they aren't probably life-threatening at the time. So this can be kind of a disconnect between why we have this response and whether it's actually good for us or not. For women, I mentioned that hormone fluctuations can really impact sleep, and there are lots of studies that look into the effects of pregnancy and menopause and menstruation, and how all of these can disrupt the sleep pattern and can cause sleep patterns to fluctuate quite a lot from one point in the month to another, and also from one age to the next. Now, something that probably almost everyone has experienced is how the ingestion of chemicals can really impact sleep patterns. And these are both legal chemicals and illegal chemicals, those that are found in drug form, so you actually are deliberately taking them as a pill, but also those that are found in food and might be something that you ingest accidentally. So things like caffeine, which is a really obvious one, alcohol, nicotine, antihistamines, heart pills, antidepressants, all of these things can really impact your sleep patterns. And caffeine, of course, is one of the ones that we're most interested in because a lot of us deliberately consume caffeine in order to have a bit of an edge and stay a bit more awake. And the reason this works is that it temporarily blocks the adenosine receptors in parts of the brain. And this means that this helps us not to feel sleepy anymore. So it kind of turns off the activity of the adenosine, which is causing us to feel that bit of sleepiness. But it only works for a certain amount of time because after a while that binding between the caffeine and the receptors wears off, and so we would need to keep putting in more caffeine in order to have that impact last. And actually researchers have found that it can be more effective to have lots of little doses of caffeine throughout the night than to have one mammoth cup of coffee or cup of tea, every few hours. That it's just kind of refreshing the effect that helps you stay a bit more awake. When we do sleep, if we've had caffeine, it can actually impact our sleep patterns as well. And you may have noticed this if you've had a late night cup of tea before going to bed. So it can decrease the amount of slow wave sleep that we have during REM, and it can increase the number of awakenings that we have, which kind of makes sense when you think about what caffeine is doing. Now, alcohol is something which a lot of people will often have late at night in order to try to help them fall asleep more quickly. But actually it can make your sleep poorer quality because it can increase the number of awakenings that you have throughout the night. So if you've ever gone on kind of a bender and then stumbled back to bed at 1 in the morning, you you may find that the next day you feel really terribly rested because you've awakened every hour or two, whether that's to go to the bathroom to get rid of the alcohol or just because you wake up and then roll over and go back to sleep. But this is something that lots of people report, that alcohol can really make your sleep quality quite a lot worse. And of course, your overall sleep environment can also have a big impact. Whether you've got light and noise in the room with you, whether the temperature is hot or cold, and you have to pay attention to these things in order to promote a nice, healthy sleep pattern. So it's quite important to know which things are good and which things aren't good, because this can really help you make wise choices in order to stay more rested. So, as I said before, it's better to use night lights instead of overhead lights if you do have to get up in the middle of the night. A lot of people will say that they need to have some amount of noise in the environment because too much quiet makes them really unnerved, but silence or very quiet kind of constant noise are actually necessary, otherwise your brain will have some issues transitioning into the deeper stages of sleep. So even if you do fall asleep whenever it's noisy, you may not go into quite the amount of deep sleep that you need in order to feel rested the next day. Now, the one thing that's not consistent from one person to the next is temperature. So we know these broad patterns for light and for noise, but temperature really is determined on a per-person basis. Generally speaking, the extremes should probably be avoided, but it's really determined by whether you're a person who kind of burns hot or burns a bit more cold. And so this is something you just have to pay attention to for yourself. And of course, the other thing that can really have short-term impacts on your sleep patterns are the sleeping activities of a partner if you've got one there with you. So anyone who has dealt with someone who snores or has sleep apnea or restless legs or night terrors or whatever the case may be, you'll know that whenever your partner is there doing all these things, it's really difficult for you to get nice, good sleep as well. That was Neko singing "Vengeance is Sleeping." And just before the break, I was talking about some of the things that can have short-term impacts on sleep patterns. And now I just want to wind up by thinking about the things that can have long-term impacts on your sleep patterns. So the most obvious of these is age. Because over time we tend to get less sleep and we also have more fragmented sleep. When we're babies, we start off needing anywhere from 16 to 20 hours of sleep a day. And of course, we kind of stagger that because we wake up and we need to feed, and so we just kind of do these things indiscriminately. And then eventually we kind of find a pattern where we can sleep in long blocks and then eat when we're awake. And as we're adults, we wind up needing about 8 hours or so of sleep, or for some people a bit less. This is just a nice average. But at the same time, we find that sleep disturbances actually become more common. So after the age of 11 or 12 or so, about 70% or more of adults will have to deal with some sort of a sleep disturbance. So even though we do have a lower sleep requirement, we're actually getting worse sleep. And so this is one of the reasons why you often, this is the phrase, wanting to sleep like a baby. They really can sleep better than we do, and it is something to be envied later on. Something else that can have a big impact is your own sleep history, so both the quantity and the quality of your recent sleep. So for instance, if you repeatedly miss a night's sleep, or you have an irregular sleep schedule, or you undergo frequent disturbance, all these things can cause you to redistribute your sleep stages and kind of alter your long-term sleep patterns. This is actually something that I experienced when I adopted a couple of very old cats a couple of years ago, because they used to wake me up all the time throughout the middle of the night, and I couldn't say no to them because they were old and they needed help, they were infirm, and so I would wake up probably 4 or 5 times every night to get up and feed them or help them in some way. And over a period of years, this completely altered my sleep schedule, and it took probably a year or 2 to get back to normal once the cats were gone. And so this is something that can really impact you and have quite a significant effect on how you feel and when you need sleep and how much sleep that you actually need. And of course, people who know this very well are those who work in shifts, or people who are experiencing jet lag a whole lot because they travel. So jet lag, for instance, can reset your internal clock. And there are two symptoms that are particularly common. And these are insomnia, when you're sleeping outside of your normal hours. So your body thinks it's one time, you're telling it it's another, and it just refuses to sleep when you want to. but also excessive sleepiness when you are awake. So again, it's not conforming to the thing that you are trying to tell your body to do, because it's basically set its clock to another time zone or another pattern. And jet lag, of course, is resulting from a mismatch between the external environment and the internal biological clock. So for you, you might have left somewhere where it was noon, but then you arrive and suddenly it's 10 p.m. and it's quite hard for your body to adjust to the fact that you've only been up in the air for a couple of hours, and yet suddenly it's nighttime, where just a while ago it was the middle of the day. And of course this can result in things like sleepiness and insomnia, as I just said, but also lots of other things. So headache, loss of appetite, gastrointestinal problems, irritability, depression, all sorts of things that start to add up over time. And you do eventually start to adapt to new external cues. If you've ever gone somewhere abroad, then you know that after a while you do start to get back on schedule. And this is called entrainment. And this happens because you are exposed to light, and you're active at the right times, you're eating meals at the right times, you're forcing yourself to sleep at appropriate times. And actually, probably the most effective of these things is light exposure. And it's quite nice to know this, because if you're going on a trip, then you can deliberately expose yourself, or not, to light in order to try to force your body to get back onto the right schedule. Shift work has kind of a similar thing, but it can be over an extended period of time. And this, because it results in more regular and longer term sleep disruptions. And the problem with shift work is that workers are being forced to stay awake when they're at their sleepiness, but then sleep when their bodies most want to stay awake. And this, of course, is compounded by the fact that, most of them have families, they have daily lives, they need to go out and go grocery shopping or drop the kids off at school, and all of those things can only be done at a certain time, and that's the time when most of them want to hurry up and get back to sleep. And it can be really difficult if you've got multiple different types of shift, so you're working different hours every day, or if you have a certain set schedule during the week but then take time off on the weekend and go back to kind of normal hours. So switching back and forth can be quite a difficult thing. And about 50% of night shift workers do report regularly nodding off or falling asleep while at work, which means that actually this can be quite a scary thing if we're thinking about people who are nurses or police or pilots or other jobs that do put other people at risk if the people doing them aren't wide awake and functioning properly. And it can be associated with lots of other difficulties, so increases in accidents, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, all sorts of things that can go along with having to do shift work and alter your sleep schedule. And actually I should say that all chronic sleep deficiencies are associated with some of these issues, these physiological problems like gaining too much weight and having diabetes. So getting good sleep on a regular schedule is actually quite important over the long term. And in fact, because of this, sleep doctors recommend that people really pay attention to their own sleep patterns and be kind of aware of what should be normal for them and what kind of conditions can help facilitate sleep and which ones are likely to disrupt sleep, so that you can really take care of yourself and make sure that you kind of find those conditions as much as possible and really get the best sleep that you can, since it does have such a huge cascade of effects on the rest of your kind of medical history and the rest of your health. Now, if you are a person who's experiencing sleep issues, or if they should arise in the future, there are lots of facilities that you can go to in order to have your sleep patterns observed and analyzed, and they'll hook you up to the EEG and all these other machines and watch your muscle movements and your eye movements and your brain waves, and they can diagnose what stage is having issues and try to help you get back onto a normal pattern. And as I've emphasized all along, it's quite important to know about sleep and get enough sleep, because it does have so many different effects on the rest of your life. And some of these, especially for people who are working at night or who need to be conscious of the health and safety of other people, it can be quite important for making sure that everyone else around you is safe as well, particularly, for instance, when you're driving or when you're out in public, perhaps feeling a little bit sleepy. So on that note, I will tell you that I'm going to put all sorts of nice links up on the Wildside webpage so that you can find out a little bit about what the brainwaves look like and what sort of thing you could expect if you have to go to a sleep center. The Harvard Medical site has a lot of great information about this, so I'll provide links to all of these things and also to the music that I've played, which I always do, so you should always check out the Wildside site after a show. So today I'm going to wind up by playing two songs actually, since I have a bit of time. The first will be Jack White singing I Guess I Should Go to Sleep, and the second should be Chris Isaak singing I'm Not Sleepy. That's all for this week, and I will talk to you next week.